All right, what is going on, everybody? We are back for our Week 8 NFL review show, joined with Max Steinberg as always here. Max, how you doing?
I'm doing well. It's good to be back with you at this NFL weekend. So
I
you
know,
said
I
you
know, I
said as
really missed
always,
it.
but then we didn't do it together last week. So
I know. If you guys missed it, Max and I actually just did an NBA review show over the weekend. That video went live Monday morning here, so we are mixing up the sports, but was nice to be back in the saddle. So I'm excited to be back this week. Thank you for holding it down while I was out. But we're gonna start as always here by looking. There were a couple of millie maker contests, so we're gonna look at the large field $20 millie. We're gonna look at the 555 for sure here. And there was a particular situation here that happened that Max is very excited to talk about with you guys here. So Max, I'll let you take it away and just tell me how to navigate.
yeah, so I just wanted to illustrate something here before we get to our regularly scheduled programming. And I was wondering, Andrew, if you could just highlight Lamar Jackson.
Of course.
As you can see in this contest, Trey McBride was about 20% owned and Jackson was about 18% owned. And something that I found pretty interesting when I took a look at this and highlighted Jackson is you can actually see that Trey McBride was stacked with Jackson, actually more than Mark Andrews. And that's really interesting, right? Because if you actually click on Trey McBride's player page, I think what you're going to see is the correlation between them is not that high. It's 0.05 for Jackson. Not that high, right? But modern DFS people love to game stack. They love to make the perfect lineup that's like quarterback and two wide receivers with a big back, right? And given that Lamar Jackson was so expensive, it makes a lot of sense to then put Trey McBride in the lineup because then you can afford him, gives you a lot of flexibility. You can make this lineup that you're like, oh, I love this lineup, right? But I think in the end, what ended up happening is Lamar Jackson, Trey McBride lineups ended up being kind of bad, in my opinion. And that's because, you just got that construction too much. And, another thing you see is Zay Flowers. If you actually clicked off Lamar Jackson, which I won't have you do, but Zay Flowers actually was really highly owned. And
He
you
was
can see how
21% right here.
Yeah, he was 21% owned, right? Was he really that good of a play? He was like an okay value, but I think what ended up happening here is the presence of Trey McBride ended up sort of pushing up the ownership of Lamar Jackson and Zay Flowers. And I just wanted to highlight this because a lot of people ask, they're like, hey, I was building and my sim ROI said this, and then I'm looking at my results and now it's saying with the actual contest, my sim ROI is this, and my lineups were not as good as I thought they would be. And the reason for that is basically, our ownership algorithm might not pick up on the fact of how people kind of the human being sort of sees what the juiciest looking lineup is. And if you can take that stuff into account, which, something that was actually pretty clear to me before the slate, I'm like, oh my God, Lamar Jackson, Trey McBride is going to be like a stack. People are going to view this as a stack. If you can take that into account, you can sort of make your lineups actually be better, even though the pre-contest MROI is not going to say so, because when the contest actually happens, you're going to see these lineups and you're going to be off of them and be doing something different and be using Trey McBride without Lamar Jackson and without Zay Flowers, which, by the way, was the key to winning on Sunday. So I just thought it was a really interesting dynamic that happened. And it just made me make sure to think about how people are going to be constructing their lineups because it can be really, really helpful to boost your profit.
I think that's an awesome like game theory type of takeaway here, right? We talk about it, and that's a full on display moment for it. So we've talked a lot about quarterback ownership, like not getting super high in the past. I think like Lamar Jackson, one of the more expensive quarterbacks on the slate, coming in at 18%, is like fairly high here, all things considered. And then you don't see
On a
another
13
quarterback.
game slate too, that's really
Right.
actually pretty high. Yeah.
Right. And you drop from 18 all the way down to 11. I mean, with Hurts and CJ Stroud, and then you don't see another quarterback until 6%. So like those are like very, very high levels of ownership for a quarterback here. And like you said, like this dynamic, I mean, average salary for 9-player lineup, 50,000 salaries, like somewhere a little above 5,000. So when you put those guys together, they average out so well. You mix in, say, Flowers, and you get this like very, I would just say, kind of like straightforward lineup construction, and that's not good, right? That is the exact opposite kind of what you want to do here. So it just becomes this game theory game so quickly, which makes playing NFL DFS and just DFS in general so much fun. So definitely like a little different scenario this week than other weeks.
Let's look at some of the top theoretical lineups for this week. Yeah, I think once again that stands out is the majority of the lineups up here. We definitely like the sort of under 5%, under 6% owned type quarterback. I don't know. What are you seeing here? Because I'm sort of drawing a blank right now. I mean, these look.
I'm trying to like look at these lineups. Like, you have like the single Trey McBride line up here, but then you have like the QB +1 with the bring back with the Ravens stack here, but then you have him naked Trey McBride again with the 49ers. So just trying to like, see if, what we were seeing there is kind of translating. And I think it is, right? You're seeing another naked Trey McBride lineup with this Bengals stack here. So just trying to like compare, if what we just said, is indeed kind of playing out here. And I'd say for the most part, yes, right? In the top 9 lineups, you only have Trey McBride with Lamar Jackson once, and then you have Trey McBride alone three other times, right? So that does seem like that is the right answer given what we're seeing.
I think the other thing is, the rest of the lineup that is Trey McBride, Zay Flowers, and Lamar Jackson does have some pretty contrarian pieces. I mean, it's using double tight end, but it's not double tight end with Mark Andrews. It's double tight end with TJ Hawkinson. It's using Calvin Ridley. It's using a sub 10% on Tony Pollard. So it's certainly one of those things where, if you can go with the chalk, if the chalk projects well, right? Just make sure you're using some of those. You got to take some like stands with some low end pieces with like a Calvin Ridley, or try to get like a double tight end or something like that in order to get contrarian enough. So that definitely stands out.
This fourth lineup is so interesting, right? You come to these top 3 lineups and you see like Breece Hall. You see all this ownership, right? Like, Alvin Kamara and Breece Hall even paired together here, right? And then you see Breece Hall, Zay Flowers, Nico Collins, Trey McBride, like a bunch of guys, 20% plus ownership. And then you see this lineup here in fourth where their highest owned player is their defense at 14%. And it's just like so interesting how you can get these just different lineup profiles and the sim still likes them. Like, wow, like blowing my mind.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting. I mean, there's definitely multiple ways to make a good lineup. And it's especially on a 13 game slate, as you're going to find some of these plays more easily where you're going to get like 2%, 1% owned type plays. And as we've seen in the past, especially with the 2-1, it's like our contest sim just loves sort of that like 2%, 3%, 4% owned QB with like guys you can stack them with that have good upside. So I'm not surprised that this super contrarian lineup it actually really likes, but it's interesting. Another thing I'm seeing is there's no CJ Stroud up here,
right?
In a lot of these lineups, and He was a guy, he was someone who got really steamed. I think I doubt that we projected him at more than maybe 5% ownership, and it came in at about double. And
That seems
I
like a
think that was
trend.
really interesting. CJ Stroud, yeah. Well,
Yeah,
no, but
no.
I think that was an interesting one too, because that was a real like, hey, this is a like DFS type of group think where people are like, oh, like Tank Dell does is like 4 fantasy points per round for zone and like 1 fantasy point per. I mean, I'm just spewing out garbage. It shows how much respect I have for this type of thinking. But it does go to show, like, or just sort of this thinking, like, oh, he's a rookie coming off a bye. He's going to be like unleashed. I'm not exactly sure what everyone is thinking. I was sort of thinking that latter thing. But what it makes me think is, hey, if you're getting carried away with something that doesn't have a lot of like actual real facts behind it or real juice or real predictive power, those are going to be the plays that are going to be the worst plays because they get higher ownership and the projection does not match that. And I think that was a real mistake there, where it's like, hey, you can just use Brock Purdy, who's cheaper and has some really good receivers that he passes to and is sort of a similar value, and you get it at way less ownership. So that's sort of standing out to me as well.
Right. Some of those just like narrative driven plays. Like, I don't know, maybe people were like, oh, it's the battle of the rookies. Like it's that, it's the revenge game. It's whatever it is. Like when you hear those narratives, like tread cautiously. Like do not buy into, I mean, I know it sounds like that's what you're saying, right? Like don't buy into the revenge games. Like don't buy in. How do you feel like about the birthday narrative, right? All those type of things that like drive ownership.
Yeah, I mean, and I admit I sort of bought into this too. I was sort of buying in the narrative like, hey, they're coming off a bye, they're going to unleash him, the battle of the rookies type of thing. And yeah, I think it's like some of those things where they feel where you see yourself and you're like, this feels like such a good play. Like I'm being smarter. What ends up happening is everyone thinks like that. And then it turns out that, this stuff just doesn't really have signal. So that's something that's sticking out to me.
I got you. Okay. You want to hop over to our users here?
Yeah, let's look at the user of the week.
Cool. So let's sort by 150. And let's look at highest sim ROI. And our top user for the week was the Grown Simba.
Interesting.
A new name?
I have not heard of this player. But maybe he's a Saber Sim user, maybe he's not.
All right. Let's start with stack exposure.
Well, seeing a lot of
stacks.
QB. Yeah, a lot of QB +2, a lot of Q. Well, yeah, actually, this person definitely went the sort of big stack route. Right? We do see QB +3.
QB +2 or more.
Yeah. Well, there's some QB +1 with a bring back there too. But yeah, a lot of that. I'm curious his player exposure.
Sure thing.
A lot of Breece Hall. So yeah, it's really interesting here, right? I feel like we see this time and time again where, if the chalk projects well, our contest sim doesn't mind. Like, hey, you want to use the chalk, use the chalk. That's fine. Just make sure you are peppering in sort of these pieces that are not chalky, right? And this person is saying, okay, I'm going to use some Michael Gallup. I'm going to use some Brandon Ayuk. I'm going to use Tyreek Hill. I'm curious his QB exposure too.
Sure. These are like
sort of
some
like
very high leverages that is like popping out to me. I mean, 7% to 40, 8% to 40, 9% to 30, like, not afraid to take big stands here.
Right. But at the same time, actually kind of just like using the chalk, right? Because Breece Hall was the most owned running back by far, and he's just slamming Breece Hall in, right? And we see time and time again with this that people think, oh, if the chalk gets over this percent ownership, I need to fade him, and that sort of idea just doesn't really play out when we do the math with the contest sim. So I think that's just, once again, just pretty interesting. I think, when you're thinking of good chalk, bad chalk, it really is about, hey, this person's really chalky, and I straight up don't think they project well and are undeservedly chalky. And that's when it's a trap. But if it's like, Saber Sim projects them well, you project them even higher and they're chalk, you're just should just play them. It's interesting with the quarterbacks, this player didn't really get too contrarian either. It just seemed like basically, maybe it just goes to show you make good lineups, right? You're not making mistakes, and those lineups can just sort of work together in a contest like this and make a really high ROI, because this person is taking stands, but they're also pretty spread out through the QB, not a lot of stands through the quarterback. It just seems like they took some stands at wide receiver that were low owned, and that sort of is driving their ROI, and maybe that they're just not making stupid lineups.
Well, they're doing what you said to do earlier, right? They full fade CJ Stroud. Hey, let's get to Brock Purdy here. You know what I mean? Like they actually
that's
saw that,
right.
Like the
Right.
3x Brock Purdy ownership here. So that's what's standing out to me, like right off the bat.
Yeah, I didn't notice that. Yeah, I mean, it's possible that avoiding CJ Stroud, who just got too high ownership, is one of the factors here that made this player have a really good group of lineups.
Yeah, I think that's
'Cause, I
actually
mean,
something I did want to like harp on a little bit. Like if sometimes I think so many people spend so much time trying to get to the right plays where, doing it backwards and like, how can I avoid the bad plays? And then let Saber Sim figure out what to do kind of from there, right? So like you're putting so much pressure on yourself to like, I gotta find like, the plays of the slate. Like sometimes you gotta do a little less. Like, you know what? How do I avoid some of the worst plays of the slate? And then you kind of let Saber Sim like, okay, we're gonna stay off this road and we're gonna go down this other road, and then Saber Sim will kind of guide you from there. So I always think like, that's an also a little bit different way to think when building your lineups that can also, you're still providing value in that way.
I think that's such a great point. I mean, I think it's really easy just focus on how do I like find the one person that's gonna like kill it for my lineup. But if you really work the other direction and say, hey, how can I avoid having some lineups in here that just are going to be negative ROI or not going to be good? How do I eliminate those mistakes? And if you can eliminate all those mistakes, that's going to raise your ROI, your theoretical ROI, quite a bit. And there's a lot of randomness in football, so that it just puts you in a better position to win. So I think that's a great point, Andrew.
Right. Yep. We're just trying to put ourselves in the best spot to get lucky, right?
Yeah,
All it is.
exactly.
All right. You want to hop over to the 555?
Sure, let's do it.
Cool. So I already have it pulled up right here. I'm gonna pop out these lineups to get us started.
Yeah. Okay. So I think one thing that's different about this contest is that it's small field, but it's really top heavy, which I think ends up making it kind of similar strategy to the bigger field millionaire maker. And you're kind of seeing similar lineups. I think that's what's interesting is, you're seeing sort of the same cast of characters too. Mac Jones is interesting in terms of someone who's at the top, just because, it seems like the contest sim actually likes him a lot, because what ends up happening is no one wants to click him. But as we saw last week with the Bills game, he's capable of having some higher upside games, and usually his pieces just come with really low ownership. So I think that's really interesting. And then we see Dak Prescott and Brock Purdy show up a lot.
Yeah, these ownerships look very similar, like extremely similar.
Right. Well, there's a little more Trey McBride, which sort of goes to show that the sharp players seem to be on him a little more than the lower stakes players. But yeah, they were similar. It seems like actually the sharp players were on Tony Pollard a lot more, which did not work, although that was a very strange game.
It was extremely strange.
Yeah. But no, it is pretty similar.
So we're going to hop over to the 4K fourth down conversion here and just kind of take a look. Like we've seen these ownership trends from the $20 be very similar to the 555 milli. But then, when we increase the stakes further, when the field gets even smaller, down to 250 total entries, like what do these ownership projections look like? And do they change a lot or do they keep some of those trends? But right off the bat here, very similar to me again, Brees gets a little more exposure. He was in the 46% range, but, gets up to 60%. But then, more Kamara, I guess a lot more Trey McBride here, right? 43% Trey McBride. That's definitely a big jump.
What's standing out to me is so, I mean, this is a fun exercise to do because you can sort of see how the sharp players are playing since this contest is going to be mostly sharp players. But what I'm seeing is Tony Pollard is now at 30%, so he's being used a lot more. And I'm also seeing Michael Gallup, actually, his ownership is rising quite a bit. Whereas, and that's what you kind of see in these higher stakes players, is they kind of ignore that kind of like narrative around players like, this player sucks, he can't catch anything, blah, blah. And they really just look at, okay, but yeah, is this player getting targets? Is he getting opportunity? Is the offense good? And can they actually score? And Gallup kind of fits into that narrative. So that's really interesting. It seems like the good players also were on the CJ Stroud train. So maybe me and some other people who got on the train weren't total dolts. But yeah, it's interesting. I'm curious what in this contest with these concentrated ownerships on a 13-game slate, if the top lineups have these players, right? It's not as top heavy as a tournament, but it would be interesting. Okay, that's the worst lineup. Yeah, I mean, that's actually funny. It turns out that Tua ends up being the stack that ends up being the best. In this type of thing when the ownership gets concentrated. And it's not that these players aren't playing Breece Hall and Trey McBride, although I'm not really seeing Alvin Kamara, which is interesting. But it is interesting that Stroud, Lamar Jackson's there, but Stroud. Although we do see Lamar Jackson with Andrews and not McBride, so that's sort of interesting. I wonder if that dynamic was stronger in this tournament. But yeah, it's sort of like theme of the day. It's just, as the chalk gets more concentrated, finding that quarterback wide receiver stack that is going to be underowned, that has that upside. They end up doing.
And it looks like
really
to me,
well.
like even at this ownership, that we still did like Tony Pollard in the Sims, right? I mean, hey, Pollard ownership kind of skyrockets. Like, hey, that's okay. He still grades out well. So I think you made a point earlier where like people will like think ownership as this like point of no return. Like, man, when ownership gets to this level, like I'm off it. Like I'm gone. I refuse to play a guy this high owned. And that's like kind of not what we're seeing, right? With the Breece Hall, like coming in at all these top sim ROI lineups, even at 61% ownership in this smaller field, as these ownerships for Trey McBride go, he's another character popping up over and over again. So I think like for so long, people have thought like, oh, when the ownership gets to, this number, like I just can't play that guy anymore. Like there's no way. But, I'm kind of seeing, arguments against that here.
That's true. I'm curious, would you mind sorting by the worst sim ROI? Because I'd be curious what the worst kind of like normal looking lineup is here. And this is actually funny because the worst lineup is a guy who's a pro and he's known for being very contrarian, need lunch money.
Very low
and
salary.
So Oh yeah, that seems like that was like some sort of like placeholder lineup. Do you want to scroll down a little bit and see if we can find
It's just like this
one that's
huge
from like
game stack. It's very interesting.
yeah, well, that could have just actually been a mistake, but I'd be curious. Okay, so this guy XOYZY is someone who has multiple entries in this contest, and it's just right. It's sort of funny. It's just like the exact thing that you'd think is like, how do you make a bad lineup? Well, you like literally don't stack. You play contrarian QB, but you don't stack them up. And then you just play some players who don't project well. It's not like rocket science. It is interesting seeing that, and SaberSim, I guess, didn't think Kamara projected as well as maybe some other people did, but it is interesting to see that Kamara and Stroud really sort of are the keys here of, hey, if you're going to make a bad normal looking lineup, that's when it's going to look like Pacheco too, right? It's just someone who, if you crunch all the numbers, the player doesn't project well, but people are narrative driven with Denver's defense is the worst defense ever, right? Maybe that's not true. And it's like playing people who don't project well, that's not part of some correlative thing. That's not part of a stack, right? I bet Amari Cooper with PJ Walker, maybe, I don't know how poorly you projected, but Amari Cooper with Geno Smith, maybe, or something, might be an okay piece to a lineup, but just playing him on his own when he just does not project well, that's really not gonna help your lineups. So I think that's something to think about as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway. We talk about getting to some of these guys, and maybe they're not the best point per dollar play, but maybe that makes them a better play. Getting these like low owned stacks, but like you're playing these non projected well pieces individually, well then it looks like your lineup gets very bad very fast.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and negative 60% ROI. And that's to say, I actually don't think these are actually negative 60% ROI. It's negative 60% ROI if SaberSim's numbers are perfect, right? Which they're not. And the market, which is this contest, is going to sort of have better projections than we do as just a singular source, right? But the thing to analyze here is like, hey, if this person kind of projects in the way that we think and you agree with that, then this is how to make a bad lineup. Whereas maybe there's someone like Alvin Kamara, where we have him at 19 fantasy points and you think he's 21 fantasy points. Well, if SaberSim had him at 21 fantasy points, he probably would be in those top lineups because his upside would mean his upside's higher, would mean all these different things, and he becomes a better play. So some of this does just depend on the projection or the upside projection of the player. And some of it depends on lineup construction. So I guess I'm sort of babbling, but I just wanted to make that point as well.
Right on. Well, hey, I'm good here, Max. I think we hit on all the key points. Do you want to give your final words?
I mean, I guess my only final word is a remarkable consistency on the types of lineups that do well. And it's not about fading the chalk. It's not about like if person gets X percent ownership, don't play them. It's all about finding that stack that's not going to be that high owned, that projects well and has upside. And you find that's sort of the key to unlocking some really high ROI lineups. So it's
well said.
It's not that complicated. Yeah.
Yeah, and avoid the bad plays, right? Stop looking for the good ones and start trying to find the ones to stay off of. I think that was something that I think some people will definitely get a little bit of a takeaway from. But as always, this is always fun. Some weeks we find more nuggets than others. I thought the ownership trends were so consistent across contests that it made it kind of kind of dry, like to compare contest to contest, because there weren't a ton of differences. Like the field was playing the same in all of these, which is an interesting takeaway kind of in and of itself. But either way, Max, always fun to have you on these shows. I was happy to be back this week, and I hope you guys enjoy this breakdown. We'll be right back next week, week 9, for our next review show. So until then, take care. We will see you guys. Thanks.